as you know, and as you mentioned in your article, Heather and I have been libeled by Wikipedia pages that ostensibly describe our role in the world from relatively early in the pandemic, at least, early in the public health campaigns against repurposed drugs and for these transfection agents, which we are calling vaccines for some reason. But in any case, I have not known the effect of having one's Wikipedia page accuse you of spreading misinformation is huge. And I would also point out quite unmeasurable. Right. Yeah. And just to lay this out from my personal perspective before we get to what's happened to you and what you discovered about what's going on at Wikipedia, YouTube demonetized DarkHorse. The sword that people see sticking through the counter behind me signifies the sword of Damocles hanging over the podcast. And basically that in the space of 1 hour, they demonetized both our channels and knocked out more than half of our family income. I believe they probably were going to shut down the channel. And I think I probably got in the way of that by talking about this on Joe Rogan's program, which alerted people to the hazard of censorship at YouTube. But in any case, this demonetization by YouTube, of course, puts us in the predicament of having to keep a roof over our children's heads and all of those things in other ways. Now, what are those other ways for people? We were professors. That was a very secure, we thought, form of income. At the point that madness drove us from our professions, we generated accidentally an alternative way of feeding our family. It worked well. Then YouTube, with a couple of moves, got in the way. The next way to fund is to go through our viewers, who YouTube has behind the scenes influence over who gets to see the channel, how many of them there are, et cetera, who gets unsubscribed without taking any action. But most importantly, we can seek advertisers to sponsor the podcast. But for an advertiser trying to decide what to do to gain some exposure for their product, they're of course going to go to our Wikipedia pages. And to have our Wikipedia pages accuse us of being dangerous spreaders of COVID misinformation, therefore obviously endangering human lives, that's not something advertisers want to mess with. So the question of, given a private, unaccountable, non-transparent system at YouTube, combined with a out of control mechanism at Wikipedia, the ability to disrupt somebody's capacity to earn is staggering.
Yeah.
Right. And that's before we get to just the simple fact of the reputational damage and what effect that has on interacting with people in the world. So, all right. What did you find? What happened to you? And what did you find about what's going on at Wikipedia?
Yeah. So what happened to me was that I was about to give evidence fun enough, in one of I think it's claimed to be the first case of the first case brought against a national government on COVID mandates, which has actually got to court. It's in Jakarta in Indonesia. And I was brought in as an expert witness on the data supporting the vaccine efficacy and safety, right? So I was scheduled to give this evidence. And about a week before I was going to give the evidence, the lawyers on our side said, do you realize that Wikipedia is saying has got you down as under COVID-19 misinformation? And it had a statement there, which I don't know if I should maybe, I can read out what it was. It basically says, in March 2021, So it says, under the heading COVID-19 misinformation, in March 2021, Fenton was one of several academics who put their name to a document seeking to persuade the British government not to pass COVID-19 legislation, blah, blah, blah. And it then quotes people saying it was ridiculous. The vaccines in question had an established safety profile. We showed a blatant disregard for the facts, irresponsible in the extreme. Now, whether or not, let's put aside whether the claims that they said we made were true or not. I never signed. That was simply, that whole thing was false. It was based on a highly misleading Times article that had been published in March 2021 by a guy, by the science editor called Tom Whipple. And it was easy. I say this idea that I'd signed this document claiming that it actually said that the vaccines, they claimed that the vaccines were causing the vaccines were causing this second wave of deaths, which was happening at the time, and that I'd signed a document, basically presented it, convincing the government and legislation. No such thing happened. I never signed. There was no such thing happened. What it was based on was this misleading report as follows, right? I happen to be one of quite a large number of people who are on this HEART group, which is basically a group, I can't remember what it stands for. It's a group which has, right from the beginning, attempted to put, let's say, a more rational narrative on the, look at the COVID data from a more rational viewpoint than what we're being presented by the governments. People would call us a group of skeptics, I'd say, but it's very, we've got, there's a broad, quite a cross section of people there. We've got very, very senior clinicians, pathologists, data scientists, etc., psychologists, that a whole group of people. And what happened was that actually I didn't even know about this, because it's not like we somehow all sit around discussing everything that we're going to do. And I'm not one of the leaders. I'm not one of this sort of the organizer or anything like that. But basically, they put out just a compendium of papers. A compendium of 9, I think it was 13 or whatever, over a dozen papers, which covered various things, right? One of which was a paper by a statistician called Joel Smalley, where he'd simply shown that there appeared to be a spike in the deaths. It's a spike in all-cause mortality after the vaccine program was rolled out. And he simply raised the issue saying, well, look, this is something which you need to look at. So there was one paper, I was not the author of any paper in that report. So my name, this idea that I signed a document, this is simply an incredible lie. My name was simply listed on the inside cover as one of the many dozens of members of HEART.
Right, and they transmuted that into... They
transmuted that to me signing a document which was saying that the vaccines were causing this second wave of injuries. So that's the basis of what the statement that was in Wikipedia about me, which I hadn't looked at my Wikipedia entry for years. It's not right. It's not something I thought about. But then to be told just before you're going to give evidence, as an expert witness in a case, that Wikipedia is saying that you're a spreader of misinformation, right? And you're claiming wrongly against all the evidence that the vaccines are causing these sort of mass deaths, which was never saying anyway. And even the article was never saying that. That was the thing. The article never said it at all. It was just ridiculous. Now, as it so happens, from the lawyers in the case kind of like managed to turn this. I didn't do anything about it. I thought, I don't edit.
Right. What can you?
I can't get. I'm not going to get people to try and go in and edit. I didn't do anything. And the lawyers were sort of quite comfortable with it, because they wanted to actually show at the beginning of my evidence that this was an example of what happens to people who actually do present a counter narrative, that they get these lies about them spread on Wikipedia.
So hold on, I have to interrupt you here and just make one point. People who have viewed a lot of DarkHorse will remember that Heather and I, on one of our live streams covered a paper by Christine Benn in which it did show that there is an increase in all-cause mortality for people who got the mRNA-based vaccines. The reverse is true. There is a slight benefit to the DNA-based adenovectored vaccines. But I just want to point out that not only were you libeled and a simple lie told about you having signed a document that you did not sign, but the content wasn't misinformation.
Exactly. I mean, that's a separate, exactly. That's a lot of the things that were actually said there. Of course, yeah, we've also done work on all-cause, looking at all-cause mortality after the vaccination. And what we can certainly conclude is that there is certainly no reduction in all-cause mortality in the vaccinated compared with the unvaccinated. So,
well, I would also point out, as long as we're here, that this is a measure in which the mortality is likely to go up with time. In other words,
absolutely,
vaccines have only existed for a year and a half. And so what we're looking at is that so far we've seen an increase in deaths, but to the extent that people might die 5 years, 10 years after these vaccinations as a result of some interference with their normal physiology, then those numbers would climb. So we can simply say that there is already evidence of an increase in all-cause mortality, which ought to be an alarming fact to anybody interested in whether or not this mass vaccination campaign was ill-advised from the get-go, which it clearly was. But the numbers we're looking at are conservative because it's still early.
Yeah, and there is absolutely a concern about the safety. And so I would actually, although I never signed that document at the time, we didn't really know anything at the time. And that article was actually the imagination of the editor of the Times into what he was interpreting what was said. And interestingly enough, in his article, this is the other thing, he never ever linked to the actual hard document. So people couldn't even see what was said. They were only getting his misinterpretation of what was said, which then, you then get these other people on Wikipedia then using and they themselves put another interpretation of his interpretation of what was said, and you get this nonsense. Okay. So the interesting thing then is that, so I didn't do anything about it. And the extent to which it compromised me in my expert evidence, I don't know. It may well have done, because people still do look at, they still do look at Wikipedia. But there was a development after that, right, where I realized just how bad. I got a tip-off, right, about a set of editing that started to go on then after with this Wikipedia, because I think I might have mentioned it. I can't remember if I mentioned it on Twitter. So obviously some people did start to look at, people who do this sort of stuff did start to look at what was going on, right? And what we found out was that one editor had tried to at least insert the following statement, that Fenton denied under oath that statement of Wikipedia was true, right? So that was inserted. That got immediately removed so there's one guy, it's not doxing because it's actually open. It's not like it's a guy called Alex Brown who goes under the wiki editor name of Alex Brun, right? Who I found out later was like very, very well known, and he was involved in the nonsense put on your Wikipedia page. He was a key one there. And he's been key in a lot of these people, Malone, McCullough. He's been involved, he's tried to trash a lot of people. He then he has this right. He's an admin. I mean, none of these things that I know anything about what it is, but he's got these admin rights where he can just, he'll just delete it. And if people start putting it in again, he'll just block those people. And that's basically what was happening. So he just deleted that one where someone just put in a factual statement, which you can see on video. There's actually video evidence of me under oath in the court saying that I denied that those accusations were not true. So he just stated a fact, and that wasn't allowed to be.
This was not Alex Brown. This was somebody else attempted to introduce a simple factual statement that you had said under oath that you didn't, which had that been in your Wikipedia entry would have caused anyone reading it to understand, there's controversy over whether or not this did or did not take place, and that you yourself had said under oath that you didn't. Obviously, you would not want to risk perjury if you had, in fact, signed this letter. So it strongly suggests something might be wrong with that claim. So that got deleted. And then there were a few, what then happened was that there was another guy, someone else actually tried to fix it completely by trying to give the background of what the Hart document actually said. So he'd gone in there and edited it by giving the full history about this Times article and how the Times article got changed over time and how it didn't represent what was said in Hart. And basically, every time that was put up, Alex Brown, within seconds, this guy, even like, it doesn't matter, any time of day, you know, or if it's like 3 a.m, at 5 a.m, you know, when he gets up, he'll have deleted it, right? So this was going on. So it was kind of like a war going on. And this went on apparently a few times, at which point Alex Brown simply blocked that person. They just simply blocked them. So they're not allowed to do anything. For trying to introduce a simply factual corrective statement into.
And that's the way they work.